Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Brabblin Brook. Today, I'm joined by Abbe Elliston from Flatpack Festival. I'm really excited to have Abbe with us. So she'll be talking us through some of the changes that Flatpack have made to their recruitment process over the last few years to try and make it as inclusive as possible. Flatpack Festival, if you're not familiar with them, run a yearly festival in Birmingham where they will put on events, but also encourage others to run their own events in a bid to use the power of the arts to help people connect to places and to one another. So Abbe, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks so much for inviting me, and what a brilliant summary of Flatpack. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much. One thing I didn't say, Abbe, can you just clarify for us, what is your role at Flatpack?
Yeah, of course. So I'm head of operations at Flatpack, which can mean everything and nothing. But essentially I have oversight for finances, also Flatpack's charity. So I look after the kind of governance, the legal side of things, making sure we're doing what we need to do there, the day-to-day operational running of the organisation, which could be anything from IT systems to new offices, a bit of logistical support with our events like the festival, and then obviously also HR. So it's a broad remit, an interesting role.
Yeah, sounds like it. Sounds like it. And it also sounds like they're really lucky to have you actually in terms of having someone that has the opportunity to spend time looking at HR and looking at recruitment. I know that I'm very conscious that a lot of the people listening from arts organisations don't always have that resource. And that's one of the reasons why I was really keen to speak to you to learn more about the changes that you have made at Flatpack. So could you just give us a kind of broad overview walkthrough of some of the tweaks that you've made to your recruitment process over the last few years, and also a little bit of the backstory as to what led you to make the changes that you have made?
Yeah, of course. So when I started at Flatpack, HR, like I say, was part of the job description, but I would say was not a big part of the job description. It was mainly like meet our legal obligations and recruit people when we needed to. But Flatpack was a brand new charity at that point as well. So it had only just been constituted and had started to grow the team. So it just hadn't really been a huge priority for them up until that point. And to be honest, for me, it was always kind of just maintaining that, because we grew quite a lot in the time since I joined. We got some extra funding, which is brilliant to allow us to do more work, but we were so busy kind of delivering all the time that it was hard to take a bit of a step back and really assess. And it was actually the pandemic, oddly, that provided an opportunity when we kind of were unable to deliver all the events that we usually do, that gave a bit of space and freedom to think a little bit about the kind of workplace that we had cultivated, if that was the kind of workplace we wanted it to be. And then that was really brought into kind of harsh focus, I would say, by the murder of George Floyd, which really had, I think a lot of organisations in the arts and elsewhere felt similarly, that it kind of gave a really big pause for, reflecting on, are we doing enough ourselves in our own way, and to make sure that we're as equitable, open, inclusive as possible. And so there were a lot of things that came out of that, around trying to create the most open and equitable workplace that we can. One of those things was kind of a real overhaul of our recruitment processes. So we did really take it right back, and start from scratch, which sounds big and scary and like it was a lot of work, but I will say it isn't. There's a lot of research out there now. There's so many resources out there that make it so much easier for you. So it took a bit of an initial time and investment, from everybody in the team, and a lot of trust from the team, to try something quite different. So we have been tweaking things like the job description for a while before that. So using things like, there's a guide for writing job descriptions for those with dyslexia that we've been using, a gender decoder tool, which you can put in and see how gendered the language is that you use, which yeah, can be a bit eye-opening. And yeah, the research has shown that heavily masculine coded words really do put off a lot of people from applying, but actually heavily feminine coded words don't. So, you know, we use all those kind of tools and we're tweaking our job descriptions, but probably hadn't really looked at the actual application process for a while. Which is where this research came into, just trying to make sure that we were up to date or staying ahead of the curve with that stuff. And that's when I came across a load of resources about CVs and the challenges of using CVs in recruitment and the limitations. So that was one of the first changes that we made, is that we got rid of CVs completely and used an application form with like work assessment questions that are designed to assess the skills and competencies of the people applying for the role, which has a scoring guide that goes with it to try and keep it objective. It's anonymized, it's randomized, so we don't read all the questions in one go for one application. We always have more than one person assessing, and we try and make sure that there's diversity in terms of the people that are looking at applications. And then we also follow that through to interview, to be honest, as well. So interview questions that are designed in the same way. They go out to candidates beforehand, to everyone. They don't have to ask for that. And we also have a scoring guide for those interview questions. A minimum of 2 people always attending an interview. We score separately before we come back together to discuss. So yeah, it was quite a big overhaul and it takes a bit of adjustment, but I will say, actually, once you get used to it, I think it saves you a lot of time in the long run. And definitely the results do speak for themselves in our experience.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. So just to recap there, so you, as you mentioned, you had already been looking at your job descriptions and making tweaks to those and using some tools that you mentioned there, which I will include links to as well for other people who are interested. But then really, would you say that it was getting rid of CVs and switching to the application form that was the sort of much bigger change that you noticed in terms of, because you said the results speak for themselves, in terms of the results that you have seen, what would you say has been the biggest impact or influence on those results, and what sort of results have you been seeing?
So definitely the changes in the job description and the language we were using, I think, did show a bit of a change in terms of we collect equal opportunity monitoring data when we recruit, which a lot of organizations will do, which is super helpful for baseline data. And I think we did see a little bit of a change when we kind of reformatted the job descriptions, but it wasn't huge. But certainly when we changed the way that we approached the actual application process, got rid of the CVs, and also kind of followed that through with the interview, which we did all together. So it's hard to separate those out, but certainly the results I do have, bear with me while I'm just going to pull up my stats so that I represent this accurately. So I just pulled up a few kind of headline stats. So 2020 was the last time we were using CVs, and I pulled out a couple of interesting stats there. So at that time, 25% of candidates identified as being from a global majority background. Now that's 40% of candidates. Also in 2020, 21% of candidates identified as being working class. That's now over a third of our candidates. And overall, we've seen an increase of 30% in applicants from underrepresented groups in the arts. And in the last 12 months, that's translated into 70% of hires have been from an underrepresented group as well. So it's pretty unequivocal that it has an impact in terms of, you know, increasing diversity within the team. But what that doesn't speak to is also the impact that it has for us as an organization, which is huge. This application process for sure means we get better quality applications from people. So the people we're hiring come better equipped with the relevant skills and competencies that we need for them to do their job well. And as well as bringing all of that, they also bring, you know, a wealth of lived experiences, other knowledge from outside of work as well, which really it benefits the organization hugely. And that also, for arts organizations, it's worth bearing in mind, it does translate into your audience engagement and development as well. If you have it within the team, it's so much easier to cultivate it, you know, in terms of audiences as well. So we have no regrets or doubts and would never go back now.
Yeah.
We've also trialed it with trustee recruitment recently, and the trustees were also really impressed with it. So yeah, on the whole, we only have really positive things to say about it.
Yeah, and as you say, I mean, those stats definitely speak for themselves in terms of the difference that it's obviously made to the organisation. I also really like the point that you made about it feeding into audience development, because we know that for arts organisations, the audience development piece is actually where a lot of the attention has been with regards to diversity. But exactly as you say, I think one of my personal bugbears has been that there's this focus on audience development in terms of diversity, but then you're not seeing that in the way that the organizations are being managed. And actually, the link between the two is pretty inseparable. If you have a more diverse team, you're more likely to be able to get the diversity of thought that's going to inform the way that you're doing your programming and your audience development and your artistic creation. And one of the things that you also highlighted before was that kind of that busyness. Arts organizations, we're so busy doing the art, doing the work, that actually taking that time to pause and reflect on the way that we're doing things is really tough. But actually, what I'm hearing from you is that taking that time to pause and reflect, not only has it benefited the kind of business in terms of just seeing the difference in the people that you're getting, but it is actually also influencing the artistry and your artistic output and your audience development as well.
Oh yeah, I mean it 100%. There'd been a whole host of changes that we've made, which I won't go into here, but it has also fed into the way that we now kind of platform opportunities for emerging artists. All of this also feeds through into that. So we do have a more diverse programming voice now because we employ a lot of these similar kind of rules. We also use some of this in terms of the way that we talk to audiences in our communications. Like, it has really infiltrated throughout everything that we do, which is also proof that like a little bit of time and energy spent in the first instance on something can have a really huge kind of long-lasting impact.
Definitely, definitely. I really want to hone in on the CV thing because, as you know from conversations that we've had, I am a massive advocate for organisations getting rid of CVs, but I find that it's something that there's often a lot of resistance to. And I'm just curious, just within this process, because again, right at the beginning, you talked about having that climate of trust at Flatpack that enabled you to really experiment. Because obviously, it's all very well and good reporting the results now, but at the beginning, you didn't know that it was going to work. And so there would have been an element of, okay, we're just going to try this and see what happens. So I'd be really interested to kind of know a bit more about where you think some of that resistance towards getting rid of CVs specifically, or even just generally making changes to recruitment processes comes from, and how you navigated that within your own processes.
Yeah, so I think if I start with why I think people are quite attached to CVs,
Yep.
I think maybe there's a couple of things here, and I know I mentioned this to you before. I think one is most of us have heard this stat that the average person spends 7 seconds looking at a CV, right? Which
Yeah.
shows just how useless they are, quite frankly. If that's all the time it takes you to read something and make a decision, it's probably not great. But I think there is a time thing. People feel like it's a quick and easy way to make a decision. But the reason it's quick and easy to make the decision is you're making a judgment on very little information that you relate to personally. So it's a job title at an organization that you know. It's a degree at maybe a university you went to. And that's why it's so quick and easy for people to make the decision about who is, best to take through to the next stage, because it's all geared to just really feed into your personal biases. And we are much more comfortable with what we know. So it's a process that's been around for so long that I can understand why people feel, I remember when we did introduce it, it was mixed feelings amongst the team. Everybody was willing to try it, which I'm, really appreciative of. I'm really grateful of it. I came heavily armed with as much information and stats as I could to say, I think it's worth trying it. But people felt like they couldn't get to know somebody without seeing a CV.
It's really interesting.
So this idea of like, well, I don't know what their background is or like what their journey has been to get to this point. But you know, what CV doesn't tell you is it might tell you that they've worked somewhere that is super renowned, but it doesn't tell you how well they did the job there. It doesn't tell
Exactly.
you what skills and competencies and characteristics they have developed from outside of their working life that they also bring into their everyday, you know, work. So you miss out on a lot of information, but it's just something we're used to. And yeah, it's because I think we place a lot of emphasis on job titles and previous places of employment, to be honest, to make a decision about whether somebody is kind of equipped to do the job. So it's really flipping it on its head when you remove all of that information. You know, you have no idea when you come to meet someone at interview, like you've got no idea really what age they might be, you know, what experience they have, if any, in your kind of sector, unless they've specifically referenced it. So it can feel a bit, you know, uncomfortable, I guess, that you're removing those things that previously you've always judged somebody by as to whether or not they'd be good enough to do the job. But I think once people tried it, everybody felt, you know, they could really see the benefit. And I do remember one of my colleagues saying that it really made them realize that there was bias that they didn't even know that they had when they were going through this process, because of how challenging they actually found it to go into it without having that kind of background knowledge on somebody.
Yeah.
So, and that is, you know, one of the reasons that we do it is to try and remove that bias, as well as to try and encourage people to apply who might previously have thought, I'm not sure I have the skills or the experience to do this role.
And I think, again, that is such an important point, because one of the things we look at with our members is sort of employer branding and how the organisation is coming across. And we always talk to people about the role of self-selection. A candidate has to self-select and self-identify in order for them to put in the time investment to apply for a role. So whilst, you know, the statement, we welcome applications from people from this background, I get the sentiment, but the reason why it's often not effective is because you can put that statement on your website, but if all of the other information and all of the other signals that you're sending to a candidate is saying, actually, I'm probably not going to fit in here, actually, probably I'm not going to stand a chance of working here. If, you know, they're saying that they want someone with this very specific experience, I know I could do the job, but I don't have that specific experience. I'm not going to waste my time applying for the role. And that's why I do think one of the reasons why removing CVs is so effective is that self-selection that candidates have to make to say, actually, I can select myself into this process because I can actually see myself doing well in it, because there's much more of a focus on my skills and experience, not do I have X organization on my CV. And as you said, CVs are really just a very, I don't even know what the word is, let's say abstract or very, very diminished version of a person's story. You know, I often use the example of people that I've met who've worked for very prestigious organizations, but the way that they've gotten in there is just because of somebody that they knew. And that's not to say that they weren't good at the role, but actually that also shows you that they weren't necessarily better than any other candidate. It's just that they had a connection. And so actually, when you rely on things like job title and previous organisation to make your initial shortlisting choice, you're actually relying on the processes of an organisation you've never even worked at.
Absolutely.
Just because the organisation is prestigious, it doesn't mean that their processes are. So it's always wild to me that people will rely on that for their own selection processes. So you shared a little bit about monitoring and evaluation with us. I wondered if you could say a bit more about that process, because I know it's something that a lot of people struggle with. So even in the work that I've done, we have we've called them candidate experience forms rather than kind of diversity monitoring, because for people from underrepresented backgrounds, there can be a little bit more of a resistance to sharing of personal data around ethnicity, and also candidates can be really dubious about how that information is going to be used. So it'd be really interesting to hear exactly what you've put in place to try and encourage candidates to share that information with you.
So we have at the top of every job application a little paragraph that explains, one, why we're using the approach that we are, why we're not using CVs, and what we hope that will achieve. We also give people the opportunity to self-identify as being from an underrepresented group in the arts, and we give some examples of what that might look like outside of demographic data. So for us, that could be someone who has experienced homelessness, for example, or domestic violence, or perhaps has sought asylum. So broadening out the definition of underrepresentation so that you don't just make it about the tick box demographic data. We do also share a completely anonymous, and it's kept completely separate to the application form, actually, a form which does collect some of that data. And we explain why we're doing it, and obviously let people know what we're doing with it. We only use it for our internal purposes, and it's really just to try and help us see, are there people that we're just not reaching, and is there something we might need to do to try and, you know, change that. So we try and just be transparent with people and honest, but also try and make sure that people don't just feel like a tick box, you know, that they're just meeting a requirement. So that's how we've approached that particular part of the monitoring. We do also look to get candidate feedback if they're happy to provide it after an application or an interview as well, which is a bit broader and, you know, not really focusing so much on, it is more about their experience of the process and how they found it, which is also as helpful in shaping it as anything else, as the kind of hard data, I guess, that you know, that qualitative data is really helpful as well. And then the other thing that we look at is the time taken. So this is a super practical, like if you're trying to make a case for this is something to persist with in the long term, you know, there are platforms that are out there that will anonymize things for you, that will randomize them for you, like they exist. You have to have money to pay for those platforms, and you probably need to recruit far more frequently than we do to make that worthwhile. So we have a fairly rudimentary spreadsheet that kind of does it for us, you know, and it can feel a little bit time consuming in the moment when you get all the applications in and you have to do that bit of work. But what we can see is the amount of time it takes people to go through the application process when there's a clear scoring guide is far less time, because actually the decisions are so much easier when you've got numbers assigned to how well somebody has demonstrated this skill, that competency. We save a lot of time in the application and interview process. And also since we've implemented it, like we've never had to re-recruit because we haven't had a candidate that meets some criteria. Like we've always found someone brilliant the first time around, and also we've kept hold of those people. They still work with us, you know, freelancers that come back because they're excellent at what they do, and also they, you know, like the organization, what we stand for. So if you're trying to make a case that it's something that's worthwhile doing, and you have stakeholders perhaps who are a little bit more conservative about it, then actually tracking the impact that it has on your organization in terms of the financial implication of having to re-recruit a role, the time spent in that process, that's another thing that some, you know, people might want to consider as well.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. I want to pick up on a phrase that you've used a couple of times, which you talked about underrepresented in the arts. And I think it's really important to make that distinction, because again, thinking back to our conversation about CVs, one of the things that tends to come through a lot is a sector-based bias. So again, I've worked with people where, for example, they'll be recruiting for a marketing role, but they'll be insisting that the person has experience of working for the specific pockets of the arts that they're in. So that could be, I heard about an art gallery who wanted to recruit for a sort of digital media, social media person, and insisting that the person has, you know, an art history or art related degree, when actually there's no need for them to be able to do that role. So I just want to pick up on your specific point about underrepresented in the arts, and what you mean by that, and how we can build our understanding of that for our sector.
Yeah, so I think That probably is also maybe a bit of a change in the way Flatpack might have thought about this from, 5 or 6 years ago, which was kind of a general underrepresentation versus what we see, not just in the arts, but also it will differ from art form to art form, frankly, as well. So I think it comes from having a good understanding of your own data, first and foremost, to help you work out, like, is there anyone that isn't coming to our events? And if not, why not? And that also, like I say, feeds into the team internally as well. You also have, funding bodies like the Arts Council that do put out reports on this kind of thing as well, and highlight, underrepresented groups, which is always, it's worth looking at. I think you can't take it in isolation. It's a lot of data from a lot of, of organizations that, might be a lot bigger than, for example, ours, which has got a permanent team of 5. So, it can look quite different from organization to organization and from art form to art form. So I think it's trying to be really aware of that as well. And it's using your own data to kind of help inform that a little bit. But yeah, we do try and also broaden it so that it isn't just about that demographic data, but it is about kind of lived experiences as well. And I think that's starting to come a bit more into the forefront of people's thinking now, is, it's not just about how old you are, or, how you identify, your gender, but actually there are people who are really underrepresented because of our life experiences they've had up until this point as well, which might be totally separate to those things, or it might be because of those things. So I think we spent quite a bit of time as a team sitting down and thinking about what underrepresentation currently looks like within our team, what it looks like within our audiences, and helping, using that to help us define that. But there are also other arts organizations that do a pretty good job of this stuff as well, and it's quite easy to find online now. So, Google can be your friend in helping to define these things as well.
Yeah, definitely. And again, one of the things we always say at Brabble is that context is king. And I'm very aware of people kind of borrowing, if you like, insights or solutions from other sectors or even other organizations that don't quite apply to their context. As you say, when it comes to representation and equity, it's always going to be context specific. So it's really, really amazing that you guys have recognized that and really implemented that in your way of working. So, Abby, before we let you go, I've just got one more question for you. And this is coming from kind of what I said at the beginning, acknowledging that a lot of organizations don't have a you. They don't have a sort of head of operations, they don't have a HR person. And so it can make a lot of this work feel really daunting in terms of having someone who can give this type of thing their attention. So if you were speaking to, a fellow arts sector colleague who's from an organization probably similar size to your team, so sort of 5 people, less than 10 people, and it's okay, we want to do this, but we don't have anyone that, is dedicated just to this. What would be your advice to them in terms of where to start and kind of maybe 1 or 2 simple changes that they could make? This is not to deny that, as you've quite rightly highlighted, it will take a bit of time in the beginning, but obviously will pay off in dividends later. But what would be your advice to that sort of organization?
Yeah, so I think I do think you have to have an understanding of where you're at currently. And if you don't, it's probably going to be hard to work out what are the changes that are going to make the most kind of impact. So I think number 1 is trying to get a good sense of, if you've got any data that you can look at already, brilliant, start collecting it. If not, so that you can really understand maybe also the severity of the issue, or, it will be different for different organizations. And I do think that helps from an initial, moving from that point onwards. And then I think it has to come down to prioritizing, focusing on skills and competencies versus job titles and work experience. And there are a lot of different ways that you can do that, to be honest. If you are not ready to let go of the CV, then you could go beyond just taking the name off, but you could remove the name of the places people have worked and just remove the education section entirely, unless it's relevant. You know, if you're hiring an architect, you need to know they've got the relevant qualifications. But if you're not, then honestly, you know, I have a music degree. I don't really think it's particularly relevant for most places. So, you know, I think you can look to remove that information entirely, to be honest, and it really does help remove quite a lot of bias. The other thing is you could actually provide a handful of questions for somebody to address in a cover letter rather
Yes.
than letting it be, you know, so it's a bit more structured and you're guiding people towards what you kind of want them to present in terms of the skills and competencies that are needed. If you can provide a little scoring guide for that, that really does help as well. It kind of keeps it a bit more objective. But if not, then at the very minimum, also like always have a couple of people look at stuff separately if you can, and try and, you know, incorporate a bit of diversity within the people assessing as well wherever possible. It always helps to have a couple of different people look at something because you will always look at it through a different lens. So if there's no scoring guide, it just helps to provide potentially a bit of balance there. So those are some quite quick things I think that people can implement straight away. But it's just really about trying to be as objective as possible and as focused on what you actually need from that person to be able to do the job.
Yes, and as you say, what you have seen at Flatpack is that you keep people for longer and you're not having to rehire because you're getting the right people, which is fundamentally what every organization wants. Abby, thank you so much for that advice. It's so helpful. And again, it's one of the things that we advocate for people, especially if you've got stakeholders who just they can't let go of CVs. We kind of call a naked CV. So you've got the kind of bare bones of the information there, but say we're redacting previous employers, we're redacting job titles, so we really are focusing on what we need to focus on. Abby, thank you so much for your time today. It's been so helpful to hear about your experiences at Flatpack. Is there anything else that you'd like to share that our questions haven't quite given you the opportunity to show? Anything you'd want to leave as a final thought for those who are listening today?
I think the only thing for me is that you can have the most inclusive recruitment process possible, but if you don't have a welcoming, inclusive and equitable working environment, you won't keep those people. So it's a brilliant place to start, but it's great if you can try and make these small changes and use the momentum to kind of carry through, because it you know, yeah, you need that golden thread really to make the change sustainable, long lasting and beneficial for everybody. So that's the only thing that I would say. So I think it's completely possible to make change with some small consistent behaviors that you build up over time. It doesn't have to be a radical change. So I think whatever you can do right now, do it. And if it's small, it doesn't matter, you're doing something. But I think any step that can be taken right now is, you know, better than nothing.
Yeah, 100% agree. Abby, thank you so much for your time.
No problem. Thanks so much.